Hey, what's going on? It's Majiinbae here with Giant Slayer to give you guys a couple of tournament tips just in time for seasonals. So the first question that I always get asked the most regarding tournaments is how do I build a lineup? If you haven't built one before, if you're new to tournaments and you're used to playing just one deck on ladder, it can be a bit daunting to have to bring 3 separate decks and put them together into a cohesive lineup. So the first tip I want to give you guys is to play decks that you're comfortable with. Showing up with some new meta decks that you're not as used to is going to really hinder your performance in the long run. You want to play decks that you're very comfortable with. It avoids the mental strain of playing something new, and you won't make as many beginner mistakes with the deck. I know you really want to play that new deck that just came out, but maybe shelf it in favor of something you're a little more used to playing. The next step is to figure out what plan your lineup has. Every lineup should come into a tournament with some sort of idea of what it wants to do. Maybe it wants to target a specific strategy. Maybe you want to bring 3 decks that are bad against one thing and then ban that one deck. There are a lot of different ways to go about it. My personal favorite and my personal recommendation to people who are just starting out in the tournament scene is to build a lineup with 3 of the strongest decks against the entire expected field. Bring decks that don't have many weaknesses and then pick your ban based on what you see each round. This strategy has a lot of pros. You get to play the strongest decks. So when you show up in each game, if your opponent's decks aren't on the same level, maybe they're trying to target a deck, your decks are naturally doing the stronger thing, and that's where I want to be each match. The only real con with this strategy is that the most powerful decks are usually the decks people are trying to target. So you may see lineups that are looking to target 1 or 2 of the decks you're bringing. Also, you are going to be playing a lot of mirror matches, and most of your matches are going to be between the 50 to 55% win rate range. You're not going to be blowing a lot of people out of the water. Again, we're looking for decks that are very strong against a vast majority of the field. Decks historically like this have been things like Fiora Shen and Ezreal Draven. The other type of lineup that I would recommend possibly bringing is what's called a targeting lineup or a bully lineup. You bring 3 decks intent on beating one specific strategy that you think people are going to bring. If they can't beat you with that one strategy, they can't beat you at all. So let's say you think a lot of your opponents are going to be bringing aggro. Your entire lineup is built on beating aggro. That means if any of your opponents bring an aggro or burn deck or something, you're going to stomp them, you're going to move on, they won't. This sounds great on paper, but unfortunately a lot of your opponents won't bring aggro. That's just kind of how it works. The field's going to be a lot more open than you expect it to be. So yes, it's fantastic when your targeting lineup runs up against its target, but I prefer not to build these lineups because if your opponent doesn't bring it, you're kind of screwed. Okay, so there is a third type of lineup that I would like to recommend to you guys, although hesitantly. This lineup is built on 3 decks that all suffer against one specific strategy, and then you show up with the plan to ban that strategy. Let's say there are 3 very strong meta decks held back by the existence of Burn. Burn is too much for these decks, it can't beat them. So what do? You throw them all in a lineup with the plan to ban Burn every single round. If you can clear out all 3 of their inherent weaknesses, your decks get a lot stronger. The only real problem with this strategy is that it's really hard to build, and often the meta doesn't quite line up for it. It's hard to find 3 very powerful decks that all only lose to one strategy. Although if you can pull it off right, this can be incredibly powerful. So in this tip, we're going to talk about how to test, and to do that, I'm going to walk you through my personal testing process. I usually start by playing a lot of games on ladder. I do this on stream anyway, and I do it a bit off stream. I like to figure out what all the best decks are and how they play against each other. I need to know which decks have a favorable matchups into which decks I would need to ban if I wanted to play this strategy, and how each matchup works out. Who's the beatdown, what are the key cards, and how do I need to mulligan. From there, I take my top 5 or 6 decks that I enjoy playing, that I think I would like to play in tournament, and I take them into scrims with friends or more time on ladder. It's important to me that I find decks that I enjoy playing, because when I don't like to play a deck, I find I don't practice with it as hard, I don't usually understand it as much, and I tend to not do very good with it. However, on the other side, if I do like a deck, I want to play it more, I want to practice it more, and I want to dive in deeper, which usually ends up with me doing a lot better in tournament play. Over the next few days to a week, I usually take the few decks that I grab from ladder and really hone them in against other decks that I expect to see in tournament against friends. Scrims are a really nice way to prepare as opposed to ladder, because not only do you get real-time feedback from your opponent, but you can focus on specific things. You could say, okay, this game's lost, let's go next. I'd really like to play against this specific strategy, but this time, can you mulligan for this card? You could really test out these niche circumstances that you won't ever get to see on ladder. I mostly do this just to get a more in-depth view of how the different matchups work and how each deck fares against everything else, but then I take it on to the next step. I look for, are there any possible cards that can entirely swing a matchup on its head if I added them? Maybe I could tech against this deck and make it a lot better. Are there any strategies that share the same weakness that maybe I can bundle into a lineup and look to ban that one deck? I do this for a bit of time until usually the 2 days before a tournament, where I try to solidify my lineup into 3 decks and I work on fine-tuning them. To do this, I ask a bunch of my scrim partners and we focus on teching against specific matchups. By teching, I mean putting in specific cards that are meant to swing one matchup or a few matchups heavily into my favor. This could be something like, if you expect a lot of go-wide strategies, you add things like Withering Wail and Avalanche when you normally wouldn't. You can tech pretty heavily in tournaments because you can ban the decks that these cards will be bad against. Do you want to play a bunch of AoE spells to blast the other expected decks in the tournament, but you're worried about control? Play the AoE spells and ban control. It gives you a lot of flexibility, which I really enjoy. And then after all that, I show up to the tournament with hopefully a lineup that is nice and fine-tuned against what I expect to see. So this tip is all about knowing and understanding matchups and how to figure them out. If you know how a matchup plays out more than your opponent, you are going to have a huge edge on the field. The first little tip I have in regards to this is understanding who is the beatdown. If you've played card games for any amount of time, you've probably heard that term thrown around a bit. What it means is who is favored as the longer the game goes on. Who needs this game to end early? That could be pretty obvious. If you are a hyper aggro deck and your opponent is a hyper control deck, you are probably the beatdown. But it can be a little more tough to figure out if it's a mid-range deck versus a mid-range deck, or maybe even an aggro deck versus a burn deck. It's very important that you take the time to learn these things because it's going to heavily influence how you approach the rest of the game, as we'll get into in a second. Let's say, for example, that you found out you are the beatdown in a specific mid-range versus mid-range matchup. This should change how you think about it entirely. If you look at your mulligans now, you understand that you need the game to end before it gets too long. So you need to mulligan for a much more aggressive start. Maybe throw back those removal spells that you've been keeping. On the flip side, if you find out that your opponent is the beatdown in the matchup, maybe look to keep more removal spells in a slower start. Look for things that clog the board early and get you towards your late game where you are favored. The next bit of this tip is understanding win conditions. If I know how I win the game and I know how my opponent wins the game, it gives me a lot of information. It's not as simple as, oh, well, my opponent attacks me to death. What you really need to look at is what sequence of plays, what cards, and what board states factor into you or your opponent winning the game. If you only lose this matchup when your opponent plays and sticks a Jinx, then you need to make sure that you keep cards that can kill Jinx in your mulligan. Maybe even save them and not use them on smaller units. If you win the game based on card advantage and eventually drowning your opponent out, then you should try to look to use your life total as an advantage and gain those sick 2-for-1s. The next bit we're going to talk about is key cards in specific matchups. Let's say that your opponent's best card against you is Jinx. Again, you need to look for ways to kill Jinx in your mulligan, but that's not all. You need to try to save a removal spell for Jinx. Maybe not use it on the smaller 2-drop, and instead save it. Take some damage if you have to. It's important that you don't let these key cards really take control of the matchup. Once you understand what the key cards in a matchup are, you need to have a plan to deal with it or make a board/game state to really neutralize its effectiveness. On the flip side, when you find what your key cards are in the matchup, you need to mulligan hard for them and try to make as profitable of a board state for them as you possibly can. When you take all these things and put them together, I think you'll find that you win a lot more of these matchups that you really truly understand. It feels very nice to go into a matchup knowing exactly what you want to do and exactly what you need to keep your opponent from doing. Alright, that's it for this one, guys. I'll see you next time.